Kansas City and St. Louis take up almost all the oxygen when people talk about Missouri. The politics, the money, the media coverage, the narrative, it all flows through those two cities. But most of Missouri is not those cities. Most of Missouri is something else entirely, older, quieter, more complicated, and carrying a set of truths that neither metro area has any real interest in broadcasting. Here are 25 facts about rural Missouri that the cities would rather you did not think too hard about. Rural Missouri contains the majority of the state's land but receives a minority of its investment. The math is not close. Missouri's two major metros, Kansas City and St. Louis, dominate state tax revenue, state political attention, and infrastructure spending in ways that leave rural counties chronically underfunded. When it comes to roads, broadband, hospitals, and schools, the gap between what rural Missouri pays into the system and what it gets back is a source of slow, sustained resentment. And that resentment shapes state politics in ways that urban Missouri consistently underestimates. 2. More than half of Missouri's counties have been losing population for decades. This is not a recent trend triggered by a single economic event. It is a structural, multi-generational decline that has been documented since the mid-20th century. Young people leave for education and do not come back. Employers do not arrive to replace what left. The communities that remain are older, thinner, and more dependent on fixed incomes and government transfers than the state's public narrative acknowledges. The decline is not a crisis that arrived. It is a condition that has been present for generations. The rural Missouri hospital system is in serious trouble. Dozens of rural hospitals across the state operate at or near financial insolvency. Several have already closed. When a rural hospital closes, it does not just affect healthcare. It affects local employment, property values, insurance access, and the basic calculus of whether a family with children or elderly relatives can afford to stay. Hospital closures in rural Missouri have accelerated in the last decade, and the communities that lose them rarely recover the economic ground they lose when the building goes dark. 4. Missouri has one of the lowest rates of Medicaid expansion adoption relative to its rural population's actual need. The state resisted Medicaid expansion for years, despite the fact that rural Missouri, which votes heavily for the politicians opposing expansion, has some of the highest rates of uninsured residents, chronic disease, and healthcare access problems in the state. Missouri voters eventually approved expansion by ballot initiative in 2020. The legislature fought its implementation. The people most affected by the delay were predominantly rural, and they were often the same voters who put the opposing legislators in office. The Missouri River and the Mississippi River both border or run through rural Missouri, and both are sources of flooding that has fundamentally reshaped rural communities over the last 30 years. This repeated flooding has redrawn maps, changed local economies, and altered daily life. The 1993 flood was the most destructive in the state's recorded history. It inundated millions of acres of farmland, destroyed towns, and forced federal buyouts of entire neighborhoods. Some communities chose not to rebuild. Others rebuilt and flooded again. The relationship between rural Missouri and its rivers is not scenic. It is a negotiation with recurring catastrophe that the state's tourism marketing never mentions. 6. Rural Missouri produces a significant share of the nation's food supply and receives almost none of the cultural recognition for it. The soybean, corn, hog, and cattle operations across the state's interior feed supply chains that reach every grocery store in the country. The farmers who run those operations work in conditions that are financial, physical, and psychological in ways that most Americans have no framework for understanding. Farm debt, commodity price volatility, consolidation pressure from corporate agriculture, and the psychological weight of multi-generational land loss are realities in rural Missouri that exist entirely outside the national conversation about food. The suicide rate in rural Missouri is significantly higher than in its urban areas, and it has been for years. This follows national rural patterns, but Missouri's rural numbers are particularly stark. Agricultural stress, social isolation, limited mental health infrastructure, cultural resistance to seeking help, and the economic precarity of small farming operations all contribute to the crisis. The crisis is documented. It is not a priority in state mental health funding, which is disproportionately directed toward urban service providers. 8. Broadband access in rural Missouri remains genuinely inadequate and has real economic consequences. Significant portions of rural Missouri counties have no reliable high-speed internet service. This is not a minor inconvenience. It affects the ability of rural businesses to operate, rural students to complete schoolwork, rural healthcare providers to use telehealth systems, and rural residents to access the remote work economy that could theoretically keep younger people in place. The broadband gap in rural Missouri is a measurable economic handicap. It is also a politically convenient talking point that has produced far more press releases than infrastructure. 9. Rural Missouri's public school systems are under sustained financial pressure, and that pressure is structurally different from urban school funding problems. Rural districts operate with smaller tax bases, fewer students to spread fixed costs across, greater distances to cover for transportation, and difficulty attracting and retaining teachers who can earn more in suburban or urban districts. Consolidation, merging small districts, is often proposed as a solution. It is deeply unpopular in communities where the school is frequently the last major institution still operating. Closing a rural school does not just affect education. It signals to the community that the state has decided the community is no longer viable. 10. The opioid crisis hit rural Missouri earlier and harder, and it received far less media coverage than it did in suburban or urban communities. The pipeline ran through prescription mills, rural pharmacies, and distribution networks that knew exactly which communities had the highest rates of physical labor, workplace injury, limited healthcare oversight, and cultural resistance to addiction treatment. Rural Missouri counties appear consistently in state overdose data. They received a fraction of the response resources that went to urban communities experiencing the same crisis on a smaller absolute scale. 11. Rural Missouri has a significant and largely under-discussed history of sundown towns, communities that enforced, formally or informally, the exclusion of black residents after dark. The practice was documented across Missouri's rural interior, and it was maintained through a combination of local ordinance, social intimidation, and violence. Many of those communities have never publicly acknowledged this history. The demographic patterns that resulted, the nearly all-white composition of many rural Missouri towns, are treated as natural geography rather than as the product of specific, deliberate exclusion policies that operated within living memory. The economic geography of rural Missouri is more complex than the farm and small-town narrative suggests. Significant portions of rural Missouri's economy run on transfer payments, Social Security, disability, Medicare, and veterans benefits, rather than on productive local enterprise. This is not a character flaw. It is a consequence of the economic transitions that removed manufacturing, mining, and agricultural employment from these communities over several decades. The same rural communities that vote most heavily against federal government spending are, in measurable economic terms, among the most dependent on it. Rural Missouri contains some of the most significant remaining old-growth and second-growth forest in the Midwest, and almost none of it is managed with long-term ecological sustainability as the primary goal. The Mark Twain National Forest covers 1.5 million acres across the state's southern tier. Timber, grazing, and recreational interests compete with conservation priorities in ways that are rarely resolved in the forest's favor. The ecological value of what remains in rural Missouri, in terms of carbon sequestration, watershed protection, and biodiversity, is not reflected in how the land is politically or economically treated. The small towns of rural Missouri are not all dying at the same rate. Some are stabilizing. A handful are quietly growing. The pattern tends to follow a specific logic. Towns with a nearby four-year university, a regional hospital that has not closed, a broadband connection, or a location within commuting distance of a larger city have measurably better trajectories than towns without those anchors. The difference between a rural Missouri town that survives and one that does not is often a single institution. One employer, one school, one road connection, whose presence or absence determines everything else. Rural Missouri's political identity is more complex than the uniform red state narrative implies. Individual rural counties vote overwhelmingly Republican in statewide and federal elections, but local politics like county commissions, school boards, and rural water districts often operate on entirely different fault lines. Personalities, family histories, land disputes, and local economic interests produce political dynamics that do not map onto national partisan categories. Rural Missouri is not a monolith. It is a collection of very specific places with very specific histories, and the people who live there know the difference, even when the people covering them from Kansas City or St. Louis do not. If you have made it this far, this is exactly what this channel is built for. Subscribe if you have not, and stay with us. The farming operations that survive in rural Missouri today look almost nothing like the family farms that the region's political identity is built around. Corporate consolidation in agriculture has accelerated dramatically over the last 30 years. The operations that remain competitive are increasingly large-scale, capital-intensive, and tied to contract relationships with major processors, which leave individual farmers with limited autonomy and significant financial exposure. The independent family farmer, the figure that anchors rural Missouri's political and cultural identity, is a shrinking demographic within the actual agricultural economy of the state. Rural Missouri has some of the lowest property tax rates in the United States, which is frequently described as an advantage and, in practice, is a structural constraint. Low property taxes mean low revenue for local governments and school districts. They reflect low property values, which reflect low economic activity, which reflects the same structural decline that low taxes are sometimes cited as a solution. The tax environment in rural Missouri is not a policy choice that positions the region for growth. It is a measurement of how little economic activity there is to tax. 18. The Missouri Bootheel is the southeastern corner of the state that juts down between Tennessee and Arkansas. It is economically and culturally distinct from the rest of rural Missouri, and it is almost never included in the state's self-narrative. It is flat delta country, with cotton, soybeans, persistent poverty, and a racial and economic history that looks more like rural Mississippi than rural Missouri. The Bootheel contains some of the highest poverty rates in the state and some of the most severe infrastructure deficits. It sits at the bottom of Missouri, geographically and economically, and the rest of the state largely treats it as someone else's problem. Rural Missouri's veterans population is disproportionately high relative to its overall population, and rural veterans face specific access problems that urban veterans affairs systems are not designed to address. Distance to veterans affairs facilities, limited transportation options, reluctance to seek mental health services, and the particular psychological profile of rural military culture all contribute to outcomes, including suicide rates, untreated post-traumatic stress disorder, and substance abuse, that are worse in rural Missouri than in the state's urban areas. The state's political culture honors military service loudly. The infrastructure supporting rural veterans is quietly inadequate. 20. The rural Missouri drug economy is not limited to opioids. Methamphetamine production and distribution has operated in rural Missouri communities since the 1980s and remains a persistent feature of the rural economy in ways that are difficult to quantify but impossible to miss in local court records, emergency room data, and law enforcement reports. Meth is not a headline crisis the way fentanyl has become. It is a background condition in parts of rural Missouri that has been present for so long, it has become functionally normalized in the communities most affected by it. Rural Missouri contains a significant concentration of federally designated persistent poverty counties, which have maintained poverty rates above 20% for multiple consecutive census periods. These are not counties that experienced a recent downturn. They are counties whose economies have not produced sufficient opportunity for their residents across multiple generations. The persistence of poverty in these counties is a structural fact, not a temporary condition, and it exists in a state that is not poor by national standards. The contrast between Missouri's overall economic performance and the conditions in its persistent poverty counties is one of the state's least examined contradictions. Water infrastructure in rural Missouri, meaning pipes, treatment systems, and distribution networks, is aging in ways that are not being addressed at the pace or scale the problem requires. Many rural water districts, built with federal assistance in the mid-20th century, are operating with infrastructure that is past its designed lifespan. Failures are not hypothetical. They are occurring. The communities affected are small enough and politically marginal enough that the failures rarely generate sustained attention. Rural Missouri's water system is a slow infrastructure crisis that is not being treated as one. 23rd. The cultural institutions of rural Missouri, the county fairs, the local newspapers, the church networks, and the fraternal organizations are declining in ways that matter beyond sentiment. These institutions were not just social amenities, they were the information networks, the civic infrastructure, and the social safety nets of rural communities. As local newspapers close, as church attendance drops, as the Rotary Club and the Grange and the Extension Office lose relevance, what replaces them is national media, national social networks, and national political narratives that have no particular interest in the specific realities of any individual rural Missouri community. 24th. Rural Missouri is not waiting passively for its situation to change. Across the state's interior, there are communities running experiments, rural broadband cooperatives, agricultural innovation hubs, small manufacturing incubators, heritage tourism operations, and remote work attraction programs that are attempting to build new economic foundations on the ruins of the old ones. Most of these experiments are small. Some will fail. A few are working. They share a common characteristic. They were built by locals who stopped waiting for the state or federal government to solve the problem, and they started building solutions with whatever was at hand. That is a very rural Missouri way of operating, and it is older than the current crisis. 25. Rural Missouri will determine the political future of the state for the next decade in ways that neither Kansas City nor St. Louis fully appreciates. The population decline of rural counties has been partially offset by their political intensity. Rural Missouri voters turnout, vote consistently, and have shaped Missouri's shift from a competitive swing state to a reliably Republican one over the last 20 years. But the math is not static. As rural populations continue to shrink and metropolitan populations continue to grow, the political leverage rural Missouri holds is a wasting asset. What rural Missouri does with that leverage in the next 10 years, and what the cities offer in exchange for cooperation, will define what kind of state Missouri becomes. Neither side is having that conversation seriously yet. That is 25 facts about rural Missouri that do not make it into the promotional materials, the political speeches, or the morning shows out of Kansas City and St. Louis. Drop a comment. Which one hits closest to home? Which one do you think the cities have been deliberately ignoring? Subscribe if this is the kind of content you came here for. Rural Missouri has been waiting a long time for someone to take it seriously. We are not stopping now.